Welcome to In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay, where we get candid about what it takes to negotiate effectively. You'll learn from the challenges and successes of entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. We help you change the nature of your negotiations and get more from every deal you do.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of In the Ven Zone. I am so excited to have you here with us today, where we work with you and help you, the small and mid-sized business owner, founder, executive, elevate your negotiations. We are all about helping you find ways to level the playing field. And we do that by bringing you really fascinating guests who share incredibly rich stories of their experiences, their successes, their trials and tribulations at the negotiation table. And so today I have to tell you, I have been so anxious and excited for this guest. So I didn't have a lot of heroes growing up when I was a kid. And some of you know, I grew up in north central Montana in a very small community of about 500, 600 people. And Mr. Bob Quinn was one of my heroes, and he is our guest today. And Bob was, I've always thought of him as, I could read his bio, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to tell you from the heart what I remember of Bob. So Bob, for me, was the pioneer of organic farming in our entire area. When organic farming was just becoming kind of a thing, and you started hearing people talk about natural food and not using pesticides, Bob took that on, and he figured that out. He was like, and it became important. It became a mission, and he started seeing things in the agricultural industry based on his background at UC Davis, where he got his PhD, and some of the things he saw there, then it troubled him. And so he decided to do something about it. And Bob is a man that when he decides to do something, let's just say it gets done. Not only was he a pioneer in organic farming in Montana, but he was also, I will actually call him the father of wind farming in Montana. So he was the first person to put a wind farm in the state. He was part of the original group, the total OG for all my millennials, the total OG in terms of developing the standards for what defines organic foods in the United States. And he worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to establish those criteria. And he's done everything from figured out how to make just a wonderful, productive and amazing opportunity for a wheat that some of you guys know called Kamut, which is an ancient grain. And Bob will talk a little bit more about that. It's very high protein, very low gluten. And he's got markets all over the world. His big market for that product was in Italy. And he's been everywhere. He's been to Mongolia. He's just been everywhere. And so coming from our little town of 550 people, where we've had some notoriety. One of the senators is from our state. And if you like his politics, that's great. If not, that's fine too. But the bass guitarist and co-founder of Pearl Jam is from our hometown of Big Sandy, Montana. And Bob Quinn, my hero, is from there too. So Bob, thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here and to hear all that. Sometimes you don't know what kind of influence you have when kids are growing up around you. So that was very kind. Thank you very much.
That is very true. It is, yeah. Because it's just, we were always, I find it weird calling you Bob, but I'm still going to call you Bob because it'd be really weird for me to call you Mr. Quinn. I actually talked to my husband about that. I'm like, should I call him Mr. Quinn? But I forgot to mention that you have a book out, which I finished reading. And I have it on my Kindle, but it's called Grain by Grain. And people, you need to read this book. This book is incredible. It's one of the best books I've read in a very long time. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Bob, kind of tell us a little bit more about kind of your path to doing all those amazing things and to being here with us today.
Well, thanks, Christine. I'm glad you mentioned the book because actually I knew we only had an hour or so I decided to write a book in case, if anything got left out. And then people can, pick up the loose ends wherever they want. But gosh, I was raised here in Big Sandy, as you mentioned. When I was in high school, there was 1,000 people in town. Now it's down to 600. My grandfather came here and started our farm and ranch in 1920. So we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of our farm last year, although the actual celebration got delayed, postponed until next year, actually. But we still had some kind of observation of the observance of the date, June 12th of 1920.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. So it was great fun. My father was raised here. I was raised here and went to school, local schools in Big Sandy. I had two great interests in growing up. One was plants. My grandfather showed me how to garden and got me hooked. Well, I love plants anyway, but he got me going in that. Not much after I was walking, and it seemed. And science, as I got older, then science became another great love of mine. So when I went to college, I combined the two at Montana State University and studied botany and plant pathology. And I got a BS and a master's there. And then I went on to UC Davis, as you mentioned, and studied plant biochemistry. I was a little bit discouraged with academia when I finished and decided not to pursue that any further. And I ended up in a couple of years back on the farm. And my whole farm then eventually became my laboratory. So I was able to study plants and systems, agricultural systems, using all kinds of controls and experiments, which I loved. Oh, and I'm still doing that after 40 years on the farm. When we got back to the farm, my wife and I had three kids already, and my parents were still here. It was 2,400 acres. It wasn't. It was about big enough for one family, just real fine, but not really big enough for two. And so we started trying to figure out how we could have enough income to survive. I didn't really want to go to town and get a job. I came home to farm. My wife with three kids and helping me, especially in harvest and seeding and those sorts of things. She already had more than a full-time job too. And we didn't want to buy out our neighbors to get bigger because, I like my neighbors. I want to have them around. And we didn't have means to do that anyway. So we tried to figure out how to add value to what we already had. And we finally started selling our high protein wheat to whole grain bakers in California. And that was the beginning of opened the door to a whole new era for me. And that was direct marketing of what we grew on the farm to those people who were interested in it. In this case, whole grain bakers. They added 1/3. We were selling for about $3 a bushel then, and they gave us $1 a bushel premium. That increased our income by 1/3, and that was enough to make the two families survive. So that was the beginning. That was kind of the beginning of a new road, and they just went on from there, just diverging and diverging.
It's amazing. And, it was, Bob used to come over to our house when I was growing up, and my dad is a dryland. He was a dryland farmer for many years. And that was why he moved to Big Sandy, is he was really passionate about it. We didn't have land. And so he was working for other people, and it got him frustrated because they wouldn't listen. So that kind of got a little old after a while. So then he went on to do some other things. But I remember I loved harvest time. I loved being out on the tractor and planting. But it was an interesting thing. And I live in downtown Los Angeles, and I get people all the time who get on a high horse about, farming practices and farmers and ranchers. And I'm like, you don't get it. I mean, when I was growing up, and you had come back to town when I was just coming into my teen years, I think. And at that time, the United States had been kind of tapped to feed the world. And in order to do that, people started taking shortcuts from nature. And you saw that. You tell a story in your book about, I remember as soon as I started reading this story about peaches, like we didn't get peaches we got peaches like once, like I had like a 2-week window a year where we got peaches, and you'd get them and you'd get them the big lugs, and they smelled so good. And then you'd spend all two more weeks canning them. And you tell the story about going to the peach farm and not being able to smell the peaches.
That was actually the first time I ever questioned what we knew as modern agriculture or industrial agriculture. They didn't really call it that, but now they call it biotech and everything else is the latest and greatest. And the chemical companies are the ones that are really parroting and selling this idea of feeding the world, which maybe we'll get a chance to talk about later, but that's just smoke and mirrors. It's really just marketing. But the truth is, when the herbicides first were introduced after World War II, I remember my dad saying they looked at them as a wonder drug. I mean, they had trouble with weeds. They would, Dad would have to ride in front of the combine and poke them into the feeder house with a pitchfork. It was very dangerous. If you'd ever fallen into that or anything, I mean, it was a challenge to deal with this. They didn't really. They had moved into this part of Montana with the homesteaders, and the homesteaders opened it up in about 1914 to 1916. In that era, they soon found they could only grow one crop every other year because it was so dry. So they summer followed 1 year. That means they cultivated the ground to save up the water, and then they would grow a cash crop the second year. So by the 1940s, there had been 20, 25 years elapsed from the first homesteaders, but only about 12 crops. So there hadn't been very much taken out of the soil, and they really hadn't gotten into figuring out good crop rotations or anything like that. It was mostly wheat, winter wheat, some spring wheat, barley, some oats. That's it. And everything was the same. And we had two big problems. We had the wheat problem, and then the fertility of the soil was going down. Just as, and then we're reading the history, it's so interesting, just as the universities, research centers were starting to study green manures and the effect of legumes on building the soil, the chemical companies showed up with this magic fertilizer that all you had to do is just scatter it to put in your drill and just scatter it on the field. You didn't have to plant anything or grow anything new or nothing. And it took care of that. So you had fertilizers and you had herbicides that solved the weed problem immediately because they were they worked really well in the beginning. And so you had almost an instant acceptance of this. And then acceptance became dependence. And then things went quite well for 10 or 20 or 30 years or so. And then the telltale signs of the compromise, like you're saying, the further you get from nature, the more unstable is the system. And this is very far from nature. If you look at nature, one of the first things you have, and this is the basic of organic, regenerative organic farming, is diversity. If you look at nature, you don't see any monocultures. Monoculture is an artificial system. And to support an artificial system, you have to have crutches. You have to have artificial means to support artificial systems. With natural systems, you mimic what's in nature with natural means. And so that's a big, big difference. And with the artificial systems, nature tends to react to them. And the weeds reacted. They didn't like to be wiped out every year. And they evolved to become resistant to herbicides. And this was an unbelievable and unexpected development. So what it required was more herbicides and different herbicides and stronger herbicides. So it's just it's a race to the bottom, and it's more and more expensive all the time. And it's really polluting more the environment. And that was the only focus. And all the way through college, in high school, even in the BOA classes and in college and everything, that's what I was taught. You were taught about, when you studied plants, you're taught about feeding what they needed and then how to give it to them. You fed them artificially. And it's hard to believe nowadays this is done today, but I had a degree in botany, which is the study of plants, without one requirement for a soils class. As if plants didn't grow in soil.
That's really remarkable. That's really remarkable to me.
Everything was so divided and compartmentalized that you thought, well, we're going to solve this problem. We're going to fix the plants the best we can by feeding them, by taking care of them, by treating them with everything they need to protect them from disease and weeds and all this stuff, without looking at nature. The way nature does it is the soil is alive and it's feeding the plants and it's being fed itself. And everything is a big cycle of taking and giving back to the environment in nature. And if we farm that way, we will be as successful as nature has been, which is a system that has lasted, thousands and tens of thousands of years. So I'd say that has some merit of success. And people talk about conventional agriculture, and they're often referring to the chemical agriculture. I said, that's not conventional agriculture.
No.
Conventional agriculture is what we've been doing for 10,000 years. And in some parts of the world, they're still doing it, and it's sustainable. What we're doing, what you're doing, my neighbors now, is a large chemical experiment. It's about 50 or 60 years old, and the wheels are coming off that bus left and right, and it's doomed. The only thing that really has a possibility for a future is renewable organic, regenerative organic agriculture, where you're renewing the soil, where you're building the soil, and the soil takes care of growing healthy plants, which then in turn makes us healthy. We were taught how we were taught in college. So that was how we were being taught. And you described very well my experience too, with growing up with peaches that came in a wooden box and were double wrapped, and you just set them on the shelf for a couple of days and they were ripe and wonderful. We got to a peach in California too. When I was at Davis, we would go out to the peach orchards that were picking peaches for local consumption. And we're going to be canning, just as you said. We were poor college students, graduate students, so we just canned all our own food that we could. And we go out to the peach orchard, and the owner of the orchard said, "Well, are you planning to can this afternoon or tomorrow?" And then, based on our answer, he'd tell us what boxes to pick from. Were they dead ripe, just had to go in the jar that afternoon, then they were that pile. Or if they were 1 or 2 days, then they'd give us something that wasn't quite as ripe. But we got home and they were just dripping with the juice and wonderful aromas and flavors. And everything. So I was on a field trip down the Central Valley, and we were going to a big peach farm, and they were harvesting. And I was quite excited about this because I love to pick peaches off the tree ripe. And we got there, and I couldn't smell anything like ripe peach. And we got one, and it was hard as a rock, and it tasted terrible. It was green. It was still not ripe, although it had the appearance of a ripe peach. And what we found out later that afternoon is that our professor had developed a petroleum spray that could be sprayed on these peaches as they got near to turning, but still were quite green and hard. And they would cause the skin to turn that blush color of reds or oranges, whatever, that made it look like a ripe peach. And then they could pick those, and they ship them in great big, not in individual crates, but in great big shipping containers that could go clear across the country without any bruising, because the peaches were dead green. Right. And when they got to the store, they put them on the shelf. And when we got back to Montana, we saw this too. And you would buy them, they looked beautiful, but when you got home, they were hard as a rock. And if you let them ripen, they often would rot from the core out, so that the inside would start to go bad before the outside was ripe. So that was really first time I ever questioned about what modern agriculture was doing. I said, "Wow, this isn't really progress." And it was doing something I loved in a very negative way, and really I thought it was false advertising. It looked like something it wasn't. And it had been created that way, or it had been managed that way just for marketing purposes and to save money and to ship easily across continents. And so that was the first time that I really started to question. I was still a long way from conversion, but it was the first question I had in my mind.
So there's a lot that you've talked about in here that I want to kind of come back to, because I know some people are going, Christine, what you're not talking negotiation as much as you did, but now I'm about to get there.
Okay.
So one of the things that I really admire about you, Bob, is that you play the entire time I've known you, which is a lot of years now. You play the long game. And in negotiation, a lot of people play the short game. And they look at what's in front of them. They negotiate just what's there, and they don't think about what's the long-term implication of doing A, B, C, or D. And that's something that, I think that, and what's interesting is I think people who are farmers and ranchers too, kind of used to have this long-term view. That because to your point, it's like 10,000. We've been farming and ranching since our existence for the most part. So, we have this long-term view, and now we've got this short-term view, and we see this short-term view. And I would suggest, especially in the United States and in the Western cultures, but it's becoming more pervasive in other cultures now too. I know you've traveled and been to a lot of places. I've worked in over 50 countries, and so I've seen it as I've moved across the globe for work. So tell me a little bit about what are some of the challenges that you've encountered having this long-term view, having this vision of what the implications are of these short-term actions, and how do you get people to buy into that vision?
That's a really good question, because right now I'm in the middle of a whole another campaign that really focuses right on what you're saying. But it's not an individual negotiation between two companies.
Right.
It's a focus on changing the way we look at food, from being a commodity. Most in our area now, people don't talk about raising food; they talk about raising commodities. Wheat and barley; those are commodities, and they go in the commodity market. And I tell whoever wants to listen to me, I tell folks that I don't raise a single commodity on my whole farm. The only thing I raise is good food, and food that nourishes people and gives them health and vitality and extends their life. That's what I grow. I don't grow commodities. And so then we get into the big discussion of the cost of organic, regenerative organic food. And I tell people, and it's because it's more expensive. And there's lots of good reasons for that. Half my farmer neighbors have gone out of business. I tell people there's a very high cost of cheap food, because the goal in this country for the last 50 years has been cheap, plentiful food. And we've achieved that goal. But there's been a very, very high cost for that food, for that cheap food. But you don't pay it at the checkout counter. You pay it, the farmers pay it, who are going broke and can't farm anymore because they don't get enough money to pay their bills from the commodities, the commodity market. The small communities pay it when all the farmers or half the farmers are gone, and they can't support the Main Street businesses anymore, and they start closing up. It's just a vicious cycle. The environment pays it. We pay it for cleanups in the environment. We have Roundup now in our rain. We have glyphosate that's used in Roundup in the rain. There's so much of it sprayed. In Iowa, some of the wells are so contaminated with nitrates that children are not allowed to drink from their well because the chemicals, the size of New Jersey. How big does it have to get before we think about it as a problem? But the greatest problem, the greatest of all, is our health. 6 out of every 10 Americans have at least one chronic disease. 4 out of every 10 have 2 or more chronic diseases. And researchers, the CDC says that 60% of the cause of that is due to the diet that people are on. And much of that goes right to the foot of food, cheap food that fills you up but doesn't nourish you, and doesn't give you the nutrients you need to stay healthy and to keep yourself your immune system strong and your body functioning properly. So I tell people, if they want to talk about the price if you're talking about the price of food, it doesn't make sense if you only talk about that without connecting it to the cost of health. And if you connect those two, and you look what's happened in the last 60 years, the sum of those two has hardly changed. It's been about 26, 27% of total what we spend in households and whatever. But what has changed is the cost of food and the cost of health have flipped. So it used to be 50, 60 years ago, the cost of food was about 18% of what you spent, and the cost of health was around 8 or 9. Now that's just the opposite. But the total between them is the same. So you cannot talk about one without the other and make sense of it. You're going to say, well, how can we afford to pay more for food? And I said, well, how can you afford not to and keep paying more for health care? No country can, it doesn't matter what kind of healthcare system you have. I'm not going to talk about that because if a significant percent of the population is chronically ill, it doesn't matter what kind of healthcare system you have, the country's going to be bust and it will not sustain that. So we have to look at changing what we're doing. And the best way to do it is start with our food production and how it's produced. And then that will drive down the cost of healthcare so we can afford to pay more for our food because we're paying only a fraction of that savings for or increased cost by reducing the cost of healthcare. So those are the two things in negotiation with USDA. I was just in a conversation with the USDA last week, and that was the first question I had. And I said, well, you've got to think outside the USDA box and include the healthcare box that's just across town from you. I don't know what building they're in, but you need to talk together. It's a whole systems approach. It's really necessary. And to talk about one separate from the other is impossible to come to a good solution.
Yeah. And I mean, you've got in this quest to kind of to redefine how we think about food. And I have always had this theory, you know, as we've, you know, built our populations and people have moved off the farms and ranches and moved into urban environments, they're not raised around food. They don't know where their food comes from. They literally have no idea. And it's through no fault of their own. It's just they don't have the opportunity. I live in a concrete jungle. We don't grow things here. You know, I go home to see my folks and drive around and you know, get to see things. But I went home and I love fresh milk. And when I say fresh milk to the people who don't know, I mean fresh squeeze, like straight out of the udder, cooled down, cream at the top. That's the best way to drink it. I still drink it. But you can't, I mean, even the farm has changed. I mean, what's available in town has changed, right? The quality of the vegetables in town aren't what they used to be. The quality of the meats aren't what they used to be. And here in Los Angeles, and even when we lived in DC area and in Boston and in New York, it's like there's food deserts everywhere. And so you go into the inner city and, you know, they don't have access to quality food at all. Everything, like there aren't very many grocery stores. The ones that are there tend to serve fried prepared foods. And so there's a huge, I know somebody who has a nonprofit that is all about educating elementary school children how to grow food. And she does it through hydroponics because there's not a lot of places to grow it. But when you think about kind of changing this view of what our food is from a negotiation perspective, it's what I call a multivariable negotiation, right? You've got politicians on all sides.
Yeah.
You've got the farming and the ranching community on one side. You have grocers. You have the big manufacturers. I think, what was it? ABC. What is it? ABCD, ABCE, whatever it is. The four guys, Archer Daniels and all those guys. Yeah. How do you find a thread that connects that? Is that thread kind of the healthcare discussion? And I can see that thread resonating in certain parts of that multivariable, multi-constituent discussion. And yet I can see others in that matrix of players just not caring about that.
Well, the trouble with the big chemical companies, pick on them, and
we can pick on them.
The big pharma is they like everything just the way it is. They don't want to change anything. If they see something beginning to change, then you can bet your bottom dollar they will also change, and they will not be left out of the market. I mean, the biggest ones will not.
Right.
If you study history and see what happened to the buggy makers when the cars came in, there were very few that made the transition from the buggies to the automobiles. I mean, Oldsmobile is a notable exception. Of course, they're hardly almost gone today, but there weren't very many that saw the change coming and adapted to it. If they will do that, then come on down. The door is open. I'm welcoming you. But if they're just going to dig their heels in and say, this is the only way to feed the world, and you've got to buy our chemicals, and if you get sick, don't worry, we have a pill for you. This is the mentality, and they have no reason to change. They're making billions and billions of dollars, and they're sucking the lifeblood out of rural America, and starting with the farmers, and then the small communities. What we need is some more local-based food production. A state like Montana, it's so big we only need a few acres to feed our 1 million people, and so we're also depending on exports, of course, but. We're not even feeding our own people. We're focusing on the export. We're focusing on feeding the world. And that is breaking us. It's a failed system. It really is. And they think that the big government planners and these big guys, they think, well, it's okay. We're just going to come down with a few giant farms, in every county. It doesn't matter that no one lives there and who would want to live there anyway. This is their mentality. And that's the kind of thing that we need to change and say that small communities and family-sized farms are important. And we need to reintroduce that. Montana is, probably one of the leading wheat producing states. We're not, we don't produce as much as Kansas. That's the first one. But for organic wheat, we're the biggest producer of organic wheat. But yet, if you take the non-organic stuff, it's like being in a boat in the ocean, just like you say, and there's not a drop to drink. You're surrounded by water, not a drop to drink. There's almost no local mills providing local flour that's grown in Montana, and the same with the meat packing companies.
Right.
I mean, they're most out of state. We send our calves out of state to be fattened. We send the cuts back in after they're butchered, and we pay the freight both ways. This is insane. We should at least have develop our own local food resources and have some food sovereignty. And every region of the country could do that. And they could produce most of what they eat within 100 miles.
Certainly. I mean, like living in California, I mean, my Lord, I mean, I was just up in the Central Valley this weekend and went to my daughter surprised me with a trip and took me to wine country and spent the weekend in Cambria. But yeah, I mean, it's like the almond trees are blooming and, there's a huge political thing here in California around water rights and all these kind of things that come into play. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you've done, I remember my mom telling me, she's like, yeah, Bob's trying to figure out how to grow apricots in Montana or peaches in Montana. And I mean, I just think, but I think that's one of the things that I talk about as a negotiator, right? And if you're going to play the long game and there's always a ripple effect, no matter what you're doing, there is a ripple effect. If you're buying a car, there's a ripple effect. If you're buying a loaf of bread, there is a ripple effect. Now, you're not going to sit and negotiate in your grocery store about how much you're going to pay for your bread. But I often say that prices should be an output of a negotiation, not the negotiation. Negotiation should not be about price. It should be about all of the elements up and down the supply chain that impact price. That's really where all those assumptions, which in the case for farming, and agriculture overall, health absolutely is part of that supply chain. I mean, it's as simple, you're talking about big pharma and, the big ag businesses. And then you were talking about, the petroleum-based spray on the peaches. And there's a thread that links all of that together. And it's like, how do you figure out that, understanding what that thread is, being well researched and well studied to figure out that thread, and then figuring out how you plug in and start to unravel it? Where do you make strategic cuts to the thread and insert an alternative that actually starts to take over? Which is what I've seen you do my whole life, ever since I've known you. That's you're when you live up, our Big Sandy is called the Pioneers. We're Big Sandy Pioneers. That's our team name. And you definitely are that person. You pioneered, and I'm sure that there were other people in the community who were very opposed to what you were doing.
Oh, yeah. I thought I was crazy.
I remember some of the stories. Yeah. But you were so confident in this different way of doing things, and you were so curious. And I work with a gentleman. One of my mentors is a guy named Blair Dunkley. I mention him almost every episode because I love how he thinks about how the mind works. But he talks about getting curious. And that's one of the things that you clearly have done is you're a very curious person and you have explored and it's led you in all these amazing directions. And one of the directions, not just on the agricultural side, but was on the wind farm component, which that's a really great story out of your book too. How you actually, were in Germany meeting, and, checking out your ancestral heritage and fell into an opportunity. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think so I love international negotiations and I just love this story because it speaks to being open and open-minded and curious to finding a solution to a bigger problem.
Well, I was you're right. I was in Germany. I was tracking down some of my ancestors, and I had ended up at a castle in northern Germany, in Ostfriesland, which is quite far north. And I knocked on the door, and the count answered and invited me in. And I had all my records so I could show him how far back I went to this castle, and actually then how we were related. He was quite impressed because not many Americans came showing him how they were related. They wanted to see his castle. And castles, as you can imagine, are a rarity in private hands now because they're so very expensive to maintain. If you're going to fix it up and make it energy efficient, all that stuff, it costs a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And one thing he had done to maintain his castle habit was build wind turbines. And he was right next to the North Sea, and they had lots of wind. And he took me up one. We climbed up the top, and he turned it off and turned it on. I'm sure that was completely against anything OSHA or anybody else would allow. But anyway, it's great fun. And he told me that he and his business partner were looking at other places to build other wind farms because Germany was about filled up, and it was hard to get permits. And they were looking at South Africa and Chile. And I said, oh my gosh, I said, you don't need to go that far. I said, well, the last time the wind quit blowing in Montana, half the buildings fell down. And so he got quite a chuckle out of that. Yep. And he said, okay, well, we'll come look. And they did. And he said, in preparing for the trip, another funny thing happened. He said, my business partner is so good. He's such a good engineer. All he has to do is look at the trees, and he can tell you about the wind. And I said, well, only one problem with the prairie. We don't have any trees on the prairie. And so it was completely new to them. And they stepped off the plane, and within, I took them to a place where the wind blows all the time called Judith Gap. You probably know, right? And they got road signs. It says, high gusty winds. I said, look at here, you don't even need to put up your wind towers. The highway department is showing you where to build. And so anyway, we put up towers anyway because they're scientists, and we were the first wind park to be taken seriously in Montana, and we were competing with many others on a first contract, and we lost that competition by being in second place. So being second really isn't too satisfying when you want to build something. But the person who was in first place actually turned out that what he had put together was a lot of smoke and mirrors, and it kind of all came apart when they started asking him to put, the pen to paper and showing how it was going to actually work. So they opened it up again, and this time we got first place. And then the power company went belly up and had to be reorganized, and so had to bid again. So we won it the third time. So we won 2 out of 3 of the proposals. The last 2 are the ones that counted. But then we had to go to the state. So you're talking about negotiations all over the place, because this is the first one we had the bird people. They were all scared to death. And I said, look, we're going to do whatever you want to give you a comfort level that this isn't going to be a bird bloodbath here. And they said, well, in some parts of California, it was just terrible because they built them in the wrong place and blah, blah, blah. And I said, so we hired engineers to come. We did something that never been done before. We had an engineer that did the did radar at night so they could see how many birds were flying at night, because they could count them in the daylight, but in the daytime, but you don't know how many are flying around at night. And there's a lot of birds that move at night. And then we took the results from that. We saw lots of them. But then when we took the results of that, and this is what hadn't been done before, and we compared it to a wind farm that had also a pre-construction data similar to ours. And then they had their after construction mortality and were able to extrapolate to what we were expecting. And that hadn't been done before. And I was able to demonstrate to our bird-loving friends, and I'm one of them too. I love birds, and that the towers would probably you'd lose 1 to 1.5 birds per year per tower. Well, the average house cat takes out way more than that, and so does the average car driving down the road. You're hitting birds, especially if you're in Montana, you're hitting birds a lot, and you're hitting more than one a year, that's for sure. And so when we were able to put things in perspective for these folks, and they could really see that we were serious about studying and seeing as best we could, and seeing the potential mortality and that sort of stuff, then we were we were friends with these guys. And in my mind, that's the best form of negotiation, to turn your adversaries into friends and work together for common goals. And that's what we were trying to do. Most of the environmental folks, their common goal was renewable energy. But the bird folks were very concerned about the cost of that renewable energy. I talked earlier about the cost of cheap food. You have to see what's behind the curtain. You have to see the whole story. And then, of course, we had to negotiate with the state for the permits and all these things, because they didn't have any permits. It had never been done before.
Right.
So we helped Montana with our expertise, or the expertise of my partners from Germany who had been building these things all for a long time, in developing standards that were reasonable to the greatest extent possible, and helpful to protect the state on one side and not throttle the builders on the other side. So that's always a kind of a tightrope. And that worked, we worked through that. We had time because of the negotiations of the actual contracts had fallen through twice. And so we had quite a bit of time to do all this, and it took that much time too. And it took five years from the time we started to the time it was built. But my goal was that Montana's first wind park wouldn't be the last one, because of all the terrible things that people would say about it. And that's what happened. And now there's many in Montana, and some bigger than the one we built. The one we built was 9,400. It was a good size one at that time. It still is good size. So anyway, that was a lot of fun. I had just sold my flour mill in Fort Benton. It started in '83, so this was about 2000. It started. I just sold that, so I had a little bit of free time, and I went from one mill to another. I told my friends. But the thing that I saw, is completely congruent between renewable energy and regenerative organic farming. To me, they're just one just smoothed right into the other seamlessly. And so I was very comfortable in both of those.
One of the things that, for the audience that I hope that you're hearing when Bob's talking is you have a great deal of clarity in a very simplistic, pragmatic way of defining what your goals were. And, we talk a lot, and I talk a lot about getting clear on what it is that you want out of a negotiation and what's your objective, right? And you did when I talk about people getting clear, I talk about knowing what you want and what's important to you, but also what's doable for your counterparts. So when you're talking about, the bird people, which I'm definitely one too, and having an understanding and figuring out how do we create a solution that allows us to be the first, but definitely not the last wind farm, and do what our birding friends need in order for them to be okay and find what we're doing acceptable, so that we're creating goodwill across all of the constituents in the negotiation, which a lot of people don't think about. I was just I did a presentation a few weeks ago, and the woman said at the end of it, she does multi-level marketing. And she's like, I'm not really sure how negotiation comes to play in multi-level marketing. And so then I did my presentation and she's like, oh my gosh. She goes, I learned for the first time that I need to think about my counterpart. And it struck me because my whole world is thinking about, to me, I always say, when you're at the negotiation table, you are the least important. I am the least important person at the table when I'm at the table, because it's all about learning what my counterpart needs and wants, and figuring out, is there a way that we can both get what we want? Or is there a way to even create more value, that we're both getting more of what we want?
Yeah.
And so I'm always thinking about my counterparts, and that's what you have done. And when you're talking about all of these stories, you're thinking about what is the long game, and what do my counterparts need? How do we all become more successful? And negotiation, I always say, is a hopeful act. Yep, we negotiate with each other because we believe that doing something together is going to have a mutual benefit for both of us that is far greater than if we were not to be doing something together. Yeah. And that's true when we dissolve relationships too. We believe that the benefit of us not working together is going to be greater than when we do. So talk a little bit more about the thread of connecting kind of renewable energy with regenerative organic farming.
Well, we used to use, before we used the word regenerative, we used sustainable a lot. We talked about organic was sustainable. And I think, and the same could be applied to energy too. So you look at what we're doing now, whatever we're doing, and you extend that out. You just keep going in the same pace, in the same direction, in the same everything. How many years can you go? How many decades can you go? How many generations can you go? How many centuries can you go, and how many millennium you can go? Well, most people don't think about that or care about that because they're only going to be here for a few decades, you see. And it'll be somebody else's problem. But I think that when I look around and I see some of the things that have come down to us from ancient Greece, and some of the philosophies and the thinkers, Hippocrates said 2,300 years ago, food should be your medicine, and medicine should be your food. This is a great idea. And it's been around for 2,300 years. Imagine that. We haven't paid much attention to it here until just starting recently, but still, I'd say that's a long-term vision, those kinds of things. And so if you're taking coal out of the ground, and there's a bottom to a mine, which there always is, at some point it's going to be gone. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to wait till it's gone to figure that out? Or are you going to say, well, you know what, maybe we can just throttle it back a little bit and still use a little coal, but not depend on it for everything, and that it'll last longer for one thing. But in the meantime, give us time to develop the alternatives. And that's what renewable energy is in my mind. We're buying ourselves time to get it better and better. I mean, solar now is surpassed wind as far as its cost, as far as the economics of return of having it. When we were doing our wind park 20 years ago, they were about neck and neck. And who knows what, we'll be down the road in developing better wind turbines, just like better solar cells have been developed in the last 20 years. So those are the things that I think are exciting. We, on our farm, are growing high oleic safflower oil. I started growing that with the idea of growing my own fuel and making biodiesel. When I found out all the problems with biodiesel and the reactions that had to be measured just so, and you had to test that, and that was pretty expensive. You had wastewater to deal with. You had the glycerin byproducts to deal with, and all these things. I got interested then in using straight vegetable oil as a replacement for diesel fuel. It couldn't be used in the winter, but we don't farm in the winter, so that's not a big problem for us. We had to preheat the vegetable oil to 160 degrees, and so we maintained the diesel tank on the tractor to start it and to get it hot and to get it running, and then we had an auxiliary tank with the straight vegetable oil on it, and we found that worked just fine. It could run all day. And so we were reducing our carbon footprint immensely by growing what we were able to then put right in the fuel tank. What happened to that, however, that kind of got thwarted when my hired man took some of our Ohio Lake safflower to town and gave it to the local restaurant. And they said, this is the best tasting fried chicken I've ever had made with this stuff. And the same with the French fries. He said, I'll pay you $2 a pound for this. So if you do your math it's not hard to do in your head. 8 pounds to a gallon times $2, that's $16 a gallon. Am I going to put $16 a gallon worth of fuel in my tractor compared to, say, $4 or $5 a gallon for diesel fuel, or $6, whatever it was at that time? So that really thwarted that idea, and we started selling it to the fry houses and stuff. And then we started providing all the oil for Montana State University and the University of Montana at Missoula. And we had a real good relationship with we first started with Missoula. And I said, I'd really like to get your used oil back and see if we could clean it up and put it in our tractor. And they were willing to work with us to do that. And so we got our very own oil back. I didn't want the cheap stuff they got, because that was all full of additives and everything. It would screw up the tractor. But the straight vegetable oil works just fine. All we had to do is take the water out of it and then clean it, filter it down to 10. If it went through that filter, then it would go into the injectors just fine. And we preheated, as I said to you, and it ran just fine. So we didn't get involved with this big controversy about raising food or fuel. Are we going to raise food or fuel on our precious acres? Because we were raising first food and then selling it the second time for fuel. And so if you can sell any of your crops twice, this really improves the bottom line, you see. And
absolutely.
So that's what we were trying to do. And we're still kind of experimenting with taking the kinks out of that. But I think it's a possibility. We don't have enough to run the cities with this, but we have enough for the farms to run themselves. They could get, if they all grew safflower, supplied local markets, and got all that used oil back and put it in their tractors, they could go a long way in fuel self-sufficiency. And so that's the kind of thing where I see the intersection of agriculture and renewable fuels, renewable energy coming right into focus.
That I love that, and that's a great story. And I after I read your book, I ordered my Kamut. I ordered the crackling Kamut. That stuff's yummy.
Yeah.
That's so good. And now I am far more aware of like everything. It's like, my daughter got something and I was like, oh my gosh, this is all GMO stuff. So I'm like, I don't want to eat it. It's like, okay. And it just really raised my awareness. Now, one of the other the stories in the book that I really liked was how because Kamut as a grain, it's a really special grain. And you talked about how, in the United States, we have this growing issue around gluten sensitivity. And the way that the United States population has dealt with it is to start to just cut wheat out of their diet entirely, which is kind of hard to do. Yeah. But that's kind of it's a reactionary kind of thing versus saying, are there other things, other properties that are driving it, and what can we do? And Kamut, because it's a low gluten grain, what you found was that in Italy, that market, they're not likely to give up their wheat. And so you were finding opportunities to sell Kamut there. But then you kind of had a question that popped up. You go, I can kind of imagine it popping up in your head going, oh, dang it. I'm in Montana selling my grain in Italy. What does that look like if they were to grow it, or if they were to use just their local wheat? And, there's a big thing around buy local and all that. But you actually took the time and made the investment to assess what the carbon footprint difference was. And again, to the audience, this goes to understanding the research, understanding what you have, what's your value that you're creating, and being able to then ultimately quantify it. But this is like an input into that negotiation. So tell us a little bit about what came out of that study and what you found.
Well, I never imagined that I would be contributing to international trade by shipping something as basic as grain across oceans. And that was never our goal. And we tried to find places in Europe even in North Africa, to grow this grain closer to the markets. And by the way, the grain, so I have to make one little technical correction here.
Oh,
so
please do.
Kamut is not the name of the grain, it's a trademark. And trademarks are used to make guarantees to the customers. So it's improper to speak as Kamut as a noun or as the name of the grain. The name of the grain is Coruscant. It's a common name like spelt or like, emmer or anything like that, einkorn. Those are common names. And the Kamut trademark was registered by our family in order to market this grain and make particular guarantees. And the guarantees we make with this grain, if you see the Kamut trademark, you know that it's always organically grown, for one thing. You know that's never been mixed with any modern wheat, any cheap wheat or anything like that. Mm-hmm. It's always high protein, high in selenium, and free of disease and pure. And so those are the promises we make or the guarantees we make with our trademark. Trademark doesn't render any ownership of the grain. Anybody can plant it and they can call it whatever they want. If they're going to call it Kamut, then they need to be part of our program. If they want to call it, whatever they want to call it, Coruscant or ancient grain or whatever, they're free to do that. So that's what we've done with that program. Let's see. Of course, we open ourselves up to criticism by and shipping grains across the Atlantic to Europe, and they were going by ship. What we found in our study, and this is quite amazing to me, I wanted to know if it was possible, and this is a long shot, I thought, to demonstrate that growing grain organically in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana, and shipping across the ocean on a ship had a carbon footprint bigger or smaller than growing it chemically right local. And what we found was they were almost the same. And if we added to that equation, growing it with renewable fuels, like my story of the oil, then we had a much smaller footprint. It's amazing to think, but the cost of the energy cost of going across an ocean on a big ship is very negligible because you're taking so much for so little fuel relatively. I mean, it's what's really the big items is when you take your car and you drive 10 or 20 miles to the grocery store and pick up one item or two, and so that the amount of energy then tabulated to that, just a couple items, just a handful or a small sack full, that's enormous. If you go once a week and you get, 4 or 5 boxes, well, that really reduces it a lot. But, and if you can shop closer to home, of course. But anyway, that's some of the things that people don't normally think about. And it was surprising that the footprints came out so similar to the kind of comparisons we were making. Because if you look at organic or chemical agriculture with all of the fuel requirements for the pesticides, the herbicides, and especially the fertilizers, about 60% of the greenhouse gases coming out of agriculture are coming from chemical fertilizer production. And if you eliminate that and are growing your own fertilizers, then it's a huge plus on that equation. So that was what we found. And so it really came out better than we expected, actually. And it was made a very interesting story to share with our customers. One thing that, and you mentioned earlier in negotiations and whatnot, when I sat down to visit with folks, I never looked at my suppliers on the one end as suppliers or my customers on the other end as the customers. I looked at them both as partners, that we were in this together and that we were going to come up with a program that was beneficial to everybody so that we weren't building our profit on the back of anybody, further up the line. And we didn't allow, because of the trademark, we could dictate a few things, and we didn't allow the manufacturers downstream to build their profits on the back of the farmers upstream. So that's how we kind of held a few extra aces, you might say, in the deck. But that's how we treated everybody, and our goal wasn't to take advantage of everybody either. I mean, we had a little carrying charge that made the whole thing work. With that extra money, we paid for about $2 million worth of research in Italy with the University of Florence primarily and the University of Bologna, published 35 peer-reviewed journal articles trying to understand the difference between modern wheat and ancient wheat that you mentioned earlier. And there was a huge difference. The breeding that we've done over the years to focus on high yields for the farmers, high yields for the bakers, and creating a bigger loaf of bread with less wheat has actually worked. But what that has done has changed so much that 20% of the people can no longer eat this modern wheat in America without some kind of difficulty. And that was what you're referring to, say, well, the easy thing, the quick thing to do. Everybody wants an instant solution. Well, the instant solution is, well, just don't eat any wheat. But then you're really losing in nutrition. There was a reason that wheat was the foundation of many ancient empires of Egypt, Babylonia, the Greeks, the Romans. I mean, they were all built on wheat. And to think, well, did it suddenly, how could it have been that bad all those years and that much success come of it? Well, the difference is that the wheat they ate is not the wheat that we're eating today. Right. And that's why we didn't really have any idea about that until we started with this ancient wheat. We found out some people just by accident who couldn't eat modern wheat could eat this without any trouble. And they actually felt better when they did eat it. And after they ate it for a while, some of them were less sensitive to other foods even. So there was really a healing thing that we were dealing with. And that was a big, amazing surprise to us. And of course, my scientific curiosity that you referred to earlier really caused me to say, we got to figure out what's going on. We found that it was anti-inflammatory, and inflammation is tied to all chronic disease. And eating this grain reduces your inflammation. So it's going to be a factor in helping reduce or modify chronic disease. That's huge. Modern wheat aggravates chronic disease. It increases inflammation to a small amount. So that's a big difference. Of course, and you say, well, what's driving this? Well, I'll tell you what's driving it is people making more money. If you can have bigger yields, the idea sold to the farmer is you're going to make more money. But what they don't tell you is that they're going to charge you more for your chemicals. So that you're not making the money. The chemical guys are making the money. And the bakers, imagine this, if you're a baker and you could sell air for the same price as bread. Well, how does that work? That's a pretty good deal, huh? So if you can get less wheat and more bread, that's what they were interested in. So with people who have wheat sensitivity, and this might be a little bit off, but I tell people that have trouble eating wheat, and it's not just gluten. But what a lot of people don't realize is with the Kamut brand wheat, the ancient grain, there's more gluten, a higher percent of gluten, a higher percent of protein than modern wheat in most cases. But that gluten is so different. It's a quality difference, not a quantity difference that's important here. So the quality is so different that people can eat it without difficulty. So if you have trouble eating wheat, there's 4 things you can do. First, buy only organic. So then you're not getting any chemical residues that might compromise your health, like glyphosate or something like that. Eat only ancient or heirloom wheats. Anything that was on the market before World War II is probably going to be okay, or at least better. Eat whole wheat. Don't eat white refined flour. I mean, you're throwing away 1/3 of the best part of the wheat. I mean, the pigs are eating better than we are. What's that about? And so eat the whole grain. It's good for your digestion. It gives you all kinds of minerals and vitamins that are not in white flour and in the right proportions and everything. The fiber is there. It's really important for you and good for your your gut activity. And then the final thing is to eat sourdough bread rather than fast rising yeast. Fast rising yeast now is very popular. It works so fast that when it's added to the bread dough, it only has time to digest the sugar that's added, which you don't really need to add sugar anyway, but that they add sugar and the yeast digests that, makes the carbon dioxide to raise the bread and make it nice and white and fluffy, and they pop it in the oven. If you ferment that in sourdough process for overnight or 24 hours, not many people do this, but if you ferment like for 48 hours, over 90% of the gluten is destroyed. It's broken down into simpler components. So the digestion is half done before you even eat it. So it's pre-digested bread, essentially. It's sourdough. Yeah. You can think of it that way. And so the finishing that digestion is very, very easy on your system. So if you do 4 of those things, you're going to probably be in the 95% chance that you can enjoy wheat again and enjoy the flavors of the new taste treats.
Yeah, I always joke. My husband always gives me a hard time because he tells me I was a terrible Montana farm girl because I've never been a huge bread eater or pasta eater or anything like that. I don't know why. I never really was. And but like I said, we just got a bunch of the Kamut grain, and so the flour, and he's gonna make some bread for me. He's
okay,
convinced I'm gonna like it.
Yeah, you will like it. And also, you can try to make sourdough pancakes. I have at least twice a week, and they're very easy and they're very tasty. Of course, you have to remember to do it the night before. You have to add the sourdough stuff.
He doesn't have a starter yet, but so he's gonna come up with a starter for
you can get those.
So,
anyway, good luck.
Yeah, I'll wish him good luck. I'm not baking the bread.
No, good luck if you're eating it.
Oh yeah, bread is his domain. But
well, Christine, let me tell you a quick story about a very negative experience I had or saw with what I call industrial organic. I had been, when we first went to Europe, we were working with a company called Lima. It was a leading biodynamic company in Belgium and for all of Europe, in fact. And they started working with us with our Kamut project. They became our exclusive importer and that sort of thing. And when I first went there, they took me to meet folks from a small town nearby that had a fairly good sized bakery that they were just negotiating to buy. And this bakery had been in the community for over 100 years, 130 or 140 years. It was kind of the bread and butter for the community. The community it's kind of like Big Sandy. And yet maybe 50, 60, 80 people worked there. It was a big amount for a small town.
Right.
And several years later, this company, Lima, was purchased by a large American organic giant, we'll say.
Two names are popping into my head.
Well, I'm not sure we want to talk about names here. But
No. I just read your book, so I
then you probably know. Okay, anyway, they bought up several of our former customers, partners. But anyway, and some of them disappeared after that. But after a time, they took an executive decision to close that bakery, and it wasn't because it wasn't profitable. It was because it wasn't making enough money. It wasn't profitable enough. So they destroyed a community, put all those people out of work, couldn't care less about that. And so that their bottom line for their quarterly reports wouldn't have this kind of dragging effect of not being up to the profit percent that was their goal. And to me, that's just the worst type of business. That when you're so focused on the quarterly report to your stockholders, you're talking about the long game and the short game. So that's just completely opposite of how I think. And and that's one of the reasons why, because sometimes in the short game, you make executive decisions and just cut things that really have a big negative long-term effect that doesn't show up on anybody's bottom line. It's in your company, but it's a big game changer to the people you just threw out of work or the company you shut down or whatever. So those are that was kind of the opposite of my long game approach and what I saw right up front that happened to my friends. And so that really made sense.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that, so I spent a lot of time working in mergers and acquisitions all over the world, and it's a well-known statistic that almost 75% of mergers fail, right? And so they not only do, it's terrible that it just doesn't work. It's really rare that it works, and so not only does the merger itself not actually generate the value that is anticipated, it also has these ripple effects, right, that also have long-term negative impacts in many cases. Now, does that mean you never ever merge? No, that's not what it means. But it means that so for me, when I'm working with clients, it's like you've got to get super clear on what the overall objectives are and try to anticipate what these follow-on effects are. Because, if you went to the executives of those companies, because that company is massive now, and owns a lot of, I mean, they bought up, if it's the one I'm thinking about from the book, then they bought up a lot of small farms. And, you know, and there was a time when they were a smaller farm. And so somewhere along the way, their values got skewed and they lost focus of where they were trying to go. And so thank you for sharing that story. I really appreciate that because it is important. And it also goes to, it's not just about you at the negotiation table, right? It also goes to that, right? It's not just about the parties at the table. Like if I'm going to go buy a car, even if my husband is not there, guess what? He's here, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. If my daughters are going to go do something, you know, or if I'm going to go do something, you know, my mom's not there, my mom and dad aren't there, but they're here, right? We take all of that with us. And so we always have invisible parties in the negotiation, people that we don't see, that we're not interacting. And a really effective negotiator pays attention to those silent partners, those people who don't have a voice at all at the table, because what happens at the table will impact them overall, and they need to be considered. And so I'm really glad that you shared that. I really appreciate it. And since we're stitching this back in, because we'd actually shut the recording off, I also forgot to ask you, how can people find you and tell them more, you know, about where to find your book, Grain by Grain?
Thank you, Christine. You can find the book at any of your favorite bookstores, or you can go online and you can find it online anywhere you want to look. It's also available as a audio and of course the Kindle you mentioned. So it's not so hard. If you're ever through Montana, just stop in Big Sandy and you can ask anybody where we live. We're about 12 miles out of town, southeast, and I'd be happy to sign your book for you. Or if you want to send it to me, I'd be glad to autograph it and send it back too. Doesn't matter. Anyway, you can find me on the Bob Quinn, organicfarmer.com. We have an Instagram there and a blog, which I'm not so active on it anymore, but you can see the historical stuff, some of it. Kamut.com is our Kamut website. You can see our research on that, besides find where local products are. Mostly they're made by other manufacturers throughout the world, and there's quite a few in this country. The leading ones are Bob's Red Mill and Nature's Path makes cold cereal. You can get the flour and grain from Bob's Red Mill almost in any store. They're all over. Eden Foods makes pasta here in America. And then lots of bread, different small bakeries are making Kamut bread, just scattered around. So those are some of the main things you can find. So good luck. And if you have any questions, just let us know.
So this has been great. Oh, Bob, I am just so grateful for you to be on the show. And, you know, for the audience, and I hope that you've picked up on some of these really important themes from a negotiation perspective, things around playing the long game, things about seeing all the players at the table as your partners, and how do you make each other more successful? How do all of it, not just I'm talking to this supplier and I'm going to make this supplier successful and me successful and screw the customer, but how do I make all of us? How do all the boats rise, right? And really it comes down to negotiating from a position of abundance versus scarcity, believing that there's enough in the world for all of us to partake, that we can do that. And, you know, Bob, that's something that you do, that's just part of your DNA. I can't imagine you doing anything else. You know, and also the importance of research. I mean, Bob, yes, he is a PhD, but he loves to research, but I'm not a PhD, and I also love to research, because it's in the research that we find the solution where we can be creative about problem solving. And if we don't care enough about the situation that we're negotiating, about the goal that we're trying to achieve, that we don't research, then we're never going to achieve the goal, because it's in that research where we find those creative solutions to problems. And you know, we might unravel something and go, oh, wait, if I unravel that, then that can go here, and you figure out how to plug everything together. And so I hope that those are some of the things that you guys listening have taken away from this. And like I said, Bob, I am just so honored and thank you so much for being such an incredible role model to me when I was growing up. And no, you did not know the level of influence that you had until we got on the phone the other day. But I really appreciate you. I really appreciate all that you're doing. And if there's anything I can do to help you with that mission, I would love to do that. And to the audience, thank you so much for sharing your most precious thing with us, and that is your time. And so we really appreciate you doing that. We're honored that you have chosen to do that. And thank you. So Bob, thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, come and see us next time you get to town. Your folks still have the nicest garden in all of Big Sandy. I
will let them know that.
Yeah, you tell them it's number one.
They do love working in it.
Yeah, they do.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And to all the listeners, we'll see you next time for another episode of In the Venn Zone. Until then, just remember that every negotiation is a conversation about a relationship, and you cannot win a relationship. Happy negotiating, everyone. Till next time. Cheers.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Venn Zone with Christine McKay. We invite you to visit our website at www.venn.zone to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Empower the negotiator in you and successfully level the playing field. Join us again next time here on In the Venn Zone.